can look at. We can see it, and some of us, unfortunately, can smell it. And this is a time of year where allergies are an issue, and yet we know in the kingdom nobody will have allergies, and we'll be thankful for that. But Father, we just, our hearts are certainly elsewhere this morning. And Lord God, with the world events going on, we certainly know that when evil men are involved, unregenerate men, whether they're of a country that we support or not, we know that at any time tempers can flare and wars can break out. And we expect them. We just pray for the salvation of the nation of Israel. We pray for the salvation of the nation of Iran. And we certainly understand that in your prophetic scriptures, even the nation of Iran will be represented in your kingdom. And though it's hard to believe now, we know that what you have spoken is true. So as we continue to go through Matthew, help us to learn and understand and apply it to our lives in the hopeful knowledge that one day you will return and set all things right. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. We just finished almost going through that first section in Matthew 24. And that is verses 4 through 14, and we gave some arguments why we think that the inter-Advent view of Walvoord, though we tremble at disagreeing with him, is probably incorrect, and why verses 4 through 14 seems to be a summary of all of the tribulation period, not just the first half. Okay. And verse 14 is one of those reasons. The first reason was the birth pangs metaphor. Certainly it splits the tribulation period into two pieces, and then it's the discussion of then the end will come. Certainly if 4 through 14 was only to represent the first half of the tribulation period, it doesn't make sense that the end would come. So almost a summary of verses 4 through 14 is the entire tribulation period. The last piece we'll cover, and then Matthew records just kind of a more detail about that second half, since that's the bulk of the issues for the nation of Israel. So last time we didn't quite get to the concluding section of 4 through 14, so we're going to continue from last week. Verse 14, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Okay, this is certainly a verse that's a favorite of the postmillennial view, and they would see the church as evangelizing the whole world through the propagation of the gospel and all nations coming under the lordship of Christ, and then Jesus comes back. Okay. I remember years ago, after the bunch of us went to Together for the Gospel conference, where dispensationalists and Reformed folks and just folks of different theological positions all come together for the gospel. We all have the gospel in common. Basically I'll use my fake watered-down version of the Shepherd's Conference that Dr. MacArthur puts on every year. So they let a more wide variety of theological persuasions into Together for the Gospel. And I think that conference has actually stopped. It doesn't go on anymore. I don't know whether that was because of the death of R.C. Sproul, who was one of the main contributors to it, or they just had enough of us dispensationalists having to correct them during the whole conference. So, all joking aside, out of one of those conferences, David Platt preached a tremendous sermon on prayer. It was just wonderful, except for this one little point in there, and he basically uses this passage, Matthew 24:14, to teach that the Lord's second coming is actually conditioned on preaching the gospel to all the nations, and he correctly understood people groups as relating to different languages and that kind of stuff. And it certainly is a fact that there's something like 7,500 languages on planet Earth. Most of them don't have the Bible translated in their language. Okay, the church is certainly trying to remedy that situation, but Platt implied that Jesus can't return until after the church does this job of evangelizing the whole world. Okay, and that goes against the doctrine of imminency, the imminent return of Christ, that he could return at any moment, that nothing must happen prior to his return. Lots of things could happen, but nothing must happen, or it's not an imminent event. I don't know if any of you are following the Edelins over there in Papua. They're busy translating 22 Bible stories into the Papua language. Okay, not the whole Bible, just 22 of the best stories. And so there's one language group that we're just starting to make inroads. The church as a whole is starting to make inroads in there. But there are so many others that there's no way, in my opinion, that the church will ever reach all of those people groups. We don't have enough people committed to learning a different language and translating it, and that has enough knowledge of everything. So given enough time, we could do that. Okay, but not likely. Now, why do I bring that up? Well, there is a portion in the book of Revelation that actually gives us the answer to this. Why is it that the church will not fulfill this obligation? And that is the angelic proclamation in Revelation 14. Okay, we won't turn there, but I believe Revelation 14 is some close to the middle, but perhaps just barely in the second half. That angel is going to have the advantage, because the text there in Revelation says that he will have the eternal gospel to preach to all those who live on the earth, to every nation and tribe and tongue and people. So this angel will have all of the language, characteristics and abilities that will be needed to carry out this preaching to all tongues. Okay, so I believe that it is Revelation 14 and that angelic proclamation during the tribulation period that is the ultimate fulfillment of Matthew 24:14. That is going to occur in the future. And again, we're in the tribulation period. Okay, this proclamation will be in the tribulation period. Okay, yes, the church, it is our job to do as much of that as we can with our tools and with our giftedness, all of that kind of stuff. But the ultimate completion of that task, I don't think comes until the tribulation period. Okay. All right, that wraps up that section 4 through 14. And we want to go on now to probably one of the more meaty topics in verse 15 and 16. So let's head them off here. Verse 15, therefore, so Jesus finishes the first section. He's just given us an overview of all the tribulation. And he begins this section with therefore. Okay, when you see a word like that, you give pause just for a second. Therefore. Okay, what do you mean, therefore? Well, based on everything that I've already said, something. Therefore. Therefore, in light of everything I've said in verses 4 through 14, I got some more stuff to say. When you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, okay, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Okay, Matthew is going to record here verses 15 through 28, characteristics of the second half of the tribulation period, which will be more intense and more severe. And this section here Jesus appeals to Daniel. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, and we have 3 passages in Daniel that specifically mention the abomination of desolation. Okay, and so we already have a framework for when and what the events are surrounding this abomination of desolation. We already have a Daniel framework. And so what do we know about the abomination of desolation? Well, number one, we know that that occurs at the midpoint of Daniel's 70th week. Okay, that last 7 years of tribulation, the abomination of desolation occurs in the middle. In the middle. The 2 halves are split into 3.5-year sections. The abomination of desolation occurs at the midpoint. Okay, how do we know that? How do we know that? Well, 2 of the 3 passages that mention abomination of desolation in Daniel are, the first one is Daniel 9:27. That speaks of the prince who is to come that will abolish sacrifices in the middle of the week. Okay, so we've got, the prince who's to come. He abolishes sacrifices in the middle of the week. Okay, and then if we look at Daniel 12:11, that mentions when those sacrifices are abolished in the middle of the week, the abomination of desolation will be set up. Okay, so it's kind of the stringing together of 2 passages. One that says the sacrifices stop in the middle. The other one says when those sacrifices stop, the abomination of desolation is set up. So it's kind of like A and B, B and C, therefore A and C. The abomination of desolation is in the middle. That's how we arrive at that. Okay, and now notice also that Jesus is talking about something that is going to happen in the future from his time frame. Okay, so back in about 33 AD, he said this is going to happen in the future. So any interpretation of the events of Daniel that try to just constrain the fulfillment of Daniel 24 or of Matthew 24 here, strictly into the doings of Antiochus Epiphanes, is incorrect, because Jesus said this abomination of desolation is still future. Okay, and there are views that say that Matthew 24 was fulfilled in the past. Okay, or that's what he's talking about. Any Daniel fulfillment too. But there are also those that believe that the 70th week, okay, that stopped, the 69th week ended at the triumphal entry. There are those that believe that 70th week, there's no gap there. It just continued on through. Okay, the problem with that is that means that all of New Testament eschatology here would be wrapped up from Daniel's 70th weeks 7 years after the triumphal entry. There's really no significant event that happened that would lead us to conclude that. Okay, and it's here is where the preterists, and we'll talk a little bit about them today. Remember, the preterists see the fulfillment of Matthew 24 as restricted entirely to 70 AD. All of this happened in the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay. Now, it's interesting because someone that believes that, they usually take a literal approach to the first 69 weeks. They would agree with our understanding that the first 69 weeks ended, in a literal 483 years from the decree of Artaxerxes all the way to the triumphal entry, exactly 483 prophetic years. They'd see that absolutely literally. But then 33 AD, then they take the last 7 years. Well, those aren't literal, though. Okay, because all of this happened in 70 AD, they'll stretch that last week to last from like 33 to 70 because they want the end point of Daniel's 70th weeks to be in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So they'll take the first part literally, and they'll spiritualize the second part into a longer time frame. Okay, one of the many errors that they make. Okay, now Jesus gives a stark warning to those who are going to be alive at the time here of the abominable desolation. He tells them that when they see this, okay, they are to flee. Okay, and again, Jesus specifically mentions that this abomination of desolation is the one spoken by Daniel the prophet. And we really want to try to understand, what is the abomination of desolation? What will it be, or likely to be, in the future? Okay, notice that Jesus says that it's standing in the holy place. Okay, in the holy place, really there's only one thing that the holy place could mean, and that is the inner sanctuary of the temple, the Holy of Holies, standing in the holy place. That's the best description, though some folks will take some liberty with that definition. Okay, the Greek word for abomination is difficult to pronounce because of the B and the D together up front. It's like Betty Lugma. It's just impossible to really say with our American tongue. I'm sure there's others, but abomination, its meaning is something that is hated or abhorred, or something detestable, and it usually has the connotation, at least in the Old Testament usage, with idolatry. Okay, the worship of false gods, which can include images and created by people. Okay, it's standing in the Holy of Holies. It says standing here, and because it's said to be standing in there, we're thinking, well, standing, that seems to be something that's implying a person, a standing, or perhaps an object standing, that kind of stuff. So it's either some idolatrous act by someone there in the Holy of Holies, or doing something detestable, or it's some type of perhaps an idol that is standing there in the Holy of Holies and sent in the temple. Now, where do we get that idea that it could be a person or an idol or something like that, a statue? Well, we mentioned that 2 of the 3 occurrences of the word abomination of desolation in the book of Daniel, okay, we've already looked at those. There's actually one other occurrence, and that's in chapter 11. Okay, and this is an important piece of it. Remember, put on your memory hat. Back in Daniel chapter 11 was a very extended, detailed prophecy of the future struggle between 2 factions of the Greek Empire, the king of the north and the king of the south. Okay, if you remember that, king of the north, we labeled it Syria, king of the south, Egypt, and it described a multi-generational type conflicts that occurred over several hundred years, and it finally ends towards the latter part of that chapter with one of the kings of the north being labeled as a despicable person, and through the contents of Daniel chapter 11, we know that person was none other than Antiochus Epiphanes, that dastardly dude in the 100 ADs, 160 ADs. And Dr. Walvoord summarizes kind of a little piece here about Antiochus here. And here he says, "As in Daniel 11:31, A prophecy was written by Daniel in the 6th century BC about a future Syrian ruler by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, who reigned over Syria about 400 years after Daniel. History, of course, has recorded the reign of this man, and in verse 31, Daniel 11:31, Daniel prophesied about his activity. I don't like his translation here, but I'll read it anyway. They shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and they shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. Okay, this would be very difficult to understand. Okay, in Daniel's day, what could this be? It'd be difficult to understand if it hadn't already been fulfilled back in the 160s by Antiochus. Anyone could go back to the history of Antiochus Epiphanes and discover what he did as recorded in the apocryphal book of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. He was a great persecutor of the children of Israel and did his best to stamp out the Jewish religion and wanted to place in its stead a worship of Greek pagan gods. Okay? One of the things he did was to stop animal sacrifices in the temple, which is predicted here. He offered a sow, a pig, an unclean animal, on the altar in a deliberate attempt to desecrate and render it unholy for Jewish worship, which it certainly did. 1 Maccabees 1:54 specifically records that the abomination of desolation was set up, fulfilling Daniel 11:31. Okay, the Holy of Holies, Antiochus, in the Holy of Holies, Antiochus set up a statue of a Greek god. Okay, and I believe the Greek or the Jewish historian Josephus said it was a statue of Zeus, which would be pretty consistent. Wanting to set up a statue of a Greek god, set up the top guy. Okay, in keeping with the prophecy, the daily sacrifices were stopped, sanctuary was polluted, desolated, and made an abomination. Okay. So that's where the idea comes from. Antiochus Epiphanes did two things. He did a very detestable, profane act on or in the Holy of Holies. He sacrificed a pig and spilled its blood on the temple, okay, on the table. Okay, that, an unclean animal sacrificed on the altar to a Jew would make that unusable now for Jewish worship. So there's a detestable thing that it could have been, but he also set up a statue of Zeus, likely, in the Holy of Holies. That's where we get the idea that the abomination of desolation is either some detestable act that someone performs there in the Holy of Holies, or some idol is set up there. We get that idea because it occurred in history as fulfillment to a Daniel prophecy. Okay, okay. So it's for that reason that we see the fulfillment in the future of the abomination of desolation to be of a similar nature, either someone doing a detestable thing or setting up a statue, a idol in the Holy of Holies. Okay. Little help from some New Testament scriptures. Okay, we're going to cheat just for a second. We've kind of made it our theme here to not go ahead of historical texts. So we don't know anything about the book of Revelation yet. We don't know anything about Paul's epistle to the Thessalonians. The events of the Gospels took place first, but just so happens that 2 Thessalonians mentions that the man of lawlessness will take his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as God. That's a pretty detestable act. You as a man sit there in the temple, proclaim yourself to be God. Yeah, that's a pretty profane act. And then in Revelation 13, it mentions that the beast from the earth will actually force the people of the earth to construct an image of the first beast, the Antichrist. And he'll actually have the power to make it speak and come to life, all that kind of stuff. I don't think it's a stretch of the imagination that idol would be placed into the Holy of Holies. So it's very likely that the future abomination of desolation will be the Antichrist in the temple proclaiming himself to be God and then setting up a statue of himself that the false prophet that we call is able to bring to life and cause unbelievers to worship that. So that's at least a possibility. Or it could be both. The Antichrist could come, he could sit, he could do all of this stuff, and then later on, that happens. Maybe that the content of the abomination of desolation mentioned here in 24 could be a combination of those two things. Okay. And you also notice that Jesus says that the abomination of desolation will be standing in the holy place. Okay, and the holy place is, again, the Holy of Holies. What's the issue today? Could that be fulfilled today? There's no temple, right? There is no Holy of Holies today. What does that imply? There will be. There will be. There will be another temple, even though there isn't one right now. There will be a third temple constructed between now and the fulfillment of Matthew 24:15. Okay, sometime in the future. Okay, that's going to wreck a lot of people's theology when that happens. Okay, it really is. It's going to be a "see, I told you so" moment, and it will be very similar to what you see if you were to read the Bibliotheca Sacra seminary journal from Dallas Theological Seminary. Prior to the 1940s or so, you will see the authors prior to the 40s, like Louis Sperry Chafer, he was the dean of the seminary then. You will see authors predicting the nation of Israel will come back into being. And that's what happened after the end of World War II. And these authors were, because they understood eschatology in the dispensational framework, they were convinced that the nation of Israel would become a nation again. They would come into existence in order to begin to fulfill the end time prophecies. Okay, I think it's going to be a similar situation. Okay, we in our camp are predicting a third temple built, and someday that will take place, and people will say, "Oh, these lunatics over here in the dispensational camp were right about a third temple. It was built, it was constructed." Okay, so now one last thing, one little thing. It's that little. I believe this is an inspired editorial comment that Matthew makes here. He says, "Let the reader understand." Now, if you have a Bible with red letters, most of them would have that in parentheses. Let the reader understand. That will be in black type. Most expositors would see that this is a comment, an inspired comment that Matthew inserts into in between the inspired words of Christ here that Matthew records. He says, "Let the reader understand." Okay. Now, what does that imply to us that Matthew actually put this little editorial comment in there? Well, it's an indication that Matthew, when he wrote down this gospel, he understood that Jesus here was not merely speaking to the 12 disciples in front of him when he was giving these instructions on the Mount of Olives at that day. Okay? there wasn't anything to read when Jesus spoke these words, right? Matthew hadn't produced his gospel. It was later that Matthew wrote that stuff down and inserted this comment, let the reader understand. That really screams that what's being portrayed here. Matthew understood Jesus is talking to some future group of people. It wasn't the disciples. Yes, Keon.
It's about the temple. It's okay. I'm kind of this. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and 16 says, knowing not that you are the temple of God.
Mm-hmm.
That is the Spirit of God which dwelleth in you. Okay, so we are the temple of God. The Spirit of God is dwelling in us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Peter said something about we are also a lively stone, built together house of God.
Mm-hmm.
So how this and Jesus is talking about there's a literal temple.
Literal temple,
absolutely.
I think he's talking about a literal future temple here. Literal.
Well, what's the meaning of it right here? Paul said that we are the temple of God, the Spirit of God.
He's using an illustration, just like Jews worshipped in the temple and performed their service and that kind of stuff. We have the indwelling Spirit that allows us to perform service and sacrifice. Spiritual sacrifice, I think, is his word in 12. But I think right here, in the holy place, Jesus is meaning a literal temple that will be constructed. So the one, I think Paul is using an illustration, okay, because it's a metaphor that Jews and Gentiles alike would understand. Okay, temple, we know what a temple is.
Yeah, but I thought thinking the Spirit of God dwelling in us, actually literally dwelling in us.
Yes.
He
literally dwells in us.
Yeah. Can I say illustrated? I'm kind of a little bit confused.
Yeah, I mean it's in the same way that the glory of God came into the Holy of Holies once a year on the Day of Atonement and was physically present. I think Paul is using that illustration to say that in the same way the Holy Spirit is within us and is present. And he views he's using an illustration that our bodies, because we're indwelt by the Holy Spirit, you can think of it as we're kind of a temple because the Spirit of God is indwelling in us. Pastor Larry, you have any other additional comments? That's a tough question.
Yeah, and I think it's good to be observant like you are too, so it's good that you're picking up on this. Yep. But if you look at the context of Matthew, everything else that he's talking about is literal. He's talking about literal nations that are going to war, literal perilous times, literal leaders. So in a context, in any kind of grammar, to take everything as literal and then pick something out and say, well, the temple's not, you're not logically flowing to the way we write language and communicate. So it would tell us instantly that what we're being communicated here, everything in this section is going to be literal. Does that make sense? Because everything else is.
Yeah.
It's kind of where we are fitting in there, as being as the temple of God.
Well, we got to remember, this is an instruction to the church. It's instruction that helps us know what's going to happen in God's plan for the future. But this is being communicated to the nation of Israel.
Yeah.
So don't mix up the two.
Yeah. When Jesus said these words, the church wasn't in existence. Okay. Right? Yeah. Okay, good question.
So how would the abomination of desolation happen if we're the temple?
Yeah.
Every time we eat pork?
Right.
I don't
Yeah. Well, we blew it at the Seder supper with them ribs then, right?
Well, that's what
Yeah.
Would that happen
Right.
if we were the temple?
That's right. Yeah.
What's funny, you study history, Antiochus Epiphanes, at the time that he desecrated the temple, we actually have historical record too that part of what he did, he took the priests and he literally forced pork down their throat to kill them.
Yep.
So he suffocated them with pork by literally jamming it down their throats.
Yeah.
He was cruel. He was a horrible man.
He was, absolutely.
And we're giving him as a picture of what is yet to come.
Yep.
And the Antichrist is going to make Antiochus Epiphanes look like a kindergartner.
Oh, yeah. Yep. Okay. Let's move on. Now, in answering what is the abomination of desolation, I think I put out a decent case that it's either a person or a thing or that kind of stuff. I want to just kind of take just a little detour here and talk about what unfortunately is the majority view today on what the abomination of desolation is. And I really say unfortunate because I scratch my head. One of the commentaries that I bought for Matthew, I mean, one of the first things I did when I got it is it was a very conservative series of commentaries too. First thing I did was, all right, let's go to Matthew, 24. How's he going to interpret this? And I mean, within a couple of paragraphs, it was obvious that even this guy, in a very conservative, series of commentaries, believes that Matthew 24 was fulfilled in 70 A.D. Okay, this is the majority view out there, and it drives me up the wall. If that's true, I want to ask one very important question, and then, in asking that question, just demolish the view, because I think it's important. If all of the events in Matthew 24 and the parallel passage in Mark 13 and the additional passages in Luke 21, if all of that was fulfilled in 70 AD, then what was the abomination of desolation? If that's already been accomplished in 70 AD, it's a fair question to ask, what was the abomination of desolation then? It had to have already occurred. What was it? Okay. Those who support this view that everything happened in 70 AD, they would say that the abomination of desolation was the Roman soldiers and their placing of their shield with their standards and ignas in the Holy of Holies. And that in itself was some profane act, because their shields have pagan symbols on them, and, they're Gentiles coming into the Holy of Holies, all that kind of stuff. So I think there are plenty of reasons why the abomination of desolation was not the Roman armies in 70 AD. I mean, and we can demolish, I think, the view. And so here's a bunch of reasons and a bunch of arguments why the abomination of desolation could not have been the Roman armies or anything associated with them in 70 AD. Okay, got some of this from Thomas Ice's articles, some from lots of commentaries on Precept Austin's website, and I put a couple in there. The last two are my own observations. So, now, the first one. If we take Jesus, what he said, and we take it literally, he said the abomination of desolation would be standing in the holy place. Okay, the holy place is a reference to the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum of the temple. Okay, we go into the text of Scripture, and we know that was to be 30 feet by 30 feet. The Holy of Holies, when they constructed it. Okay, it was also known that Titus, when he attacked Jerusalem, was given 4 legions of soldiers, and that totals 60,000 men. 60,000 men. So, if the Roman army was the abomination of desolation, how did 60,000 men fit into a 30 by 30 room? Fairly unlikely. I mean, how big is this room? 20 by 20, maybe? Most of a 30 by 30, and there's, a dozen of us in here. We could fit a couple more dozen, but 60,000? It's a stretch, right? It's a stretch. And some actually do recognize that that's an issue, and they'll play little word games with what Jesus said here, and we'll get to some of that. Number 2, those who see the events in Luke and in Matthew as describing the same thing, okay, really have to equate standing, that Jesus says here, abomination, desolation, standing, but in Luke it says the armies surround Jerusalem. They have to equate standing with surrounding. Now, how you do that? It's 2 separate verbs. They mean different things, but they need to be made to be the same thing if you're going to equate the events in Matthew with the events in Luke. Okay, Luke says that Jerusalem would be surrounded by the Roman army. Jerusalem is surrounded, but Jesus is very specific when he mentions the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies is this little section. It's not all of Jerusalem. Okay, Luke says the armies surround Jerusalem. Jesus says abomination of desolation in the Holy of Holies here. Okay. Here's an interesting one. The parallel passage in Mark 13 uses the masculine singular gender for the verb standing. Okay, in Greek verbs, they include gender. Okay, masculine singular form of standing here that's used in Mark. Difficult to envision how, a 60,000 member Roman army is going to be masculine singular. Okay. Now, occasionally in Greek, the neuter singular is used to represent a group. Okay, and Matthew does use the masculine singular here, but it may also be one is a person, another is an object. Okay, kind of what we've mentioned here. Okay. Number 5, Daniel, or Jesus refers to Daniel, so we could assume that Daniel explains this abomination of desolation quite a bit, or Jesus wouldn't have mentioned Daniel doing it. You know that Daniel talks extensively about the person that sets up the abomination of desolation. Who is that? Okay, it's the little horn, or the prince who is to come, the willful king. We know him by several names. But is there any indication in any of those texts in Daniel that an army, the Roman army, is implied? Okay, I'd say no, there is none. Okay, now we get to the really good, the good ones. Number 6, probably the biggest problem with the abomination of desolation being the Roman army in 70 AD is that by the time the Roman army would have been standing in the holy place, would have been too late for someone to flee. Right? Jesus gives instructions. When you see the abomination of desolation, flee. Flee to the mountains. Okay? And really, even the expositors that hold this view recognize that that's a severe problem for their position. The honest ones do. And there are honest ones, right? We're talking about fellow believers here that believe this. We're not talking about, unbelievers and they're just wrong in their view. We're talking about sincere believers. The honest ones actually have written, yeah, we see this. This is one of the problems with our view. Okay? But some others, they really are going to resort to some type of, grammatical bit twiddling. Okay? Just some changing of words in the text. For instance, Broadus says, the holy place cannot well mean distinctively the temple in this case. He recognizes that too many soldiers, doesn't have the ability to flee, couldn't fit in the Holy of Holies. So his approach is, well, the holy place, it really can't mean the Holy of Holies. It's got to be a little bit wider meaning of the temple complex and actually probably even Jerusalem as a whole. So they will interpolate the word, a holy place and make it spatially bigger here. Now, here's some more problems. The Jewish historian Josephus, who, was around the time, he mentions that when the walls of the city were finally scaled by the Roman soldiers, first thing they did was burn the temple. Okay, they burned the temple before, hardly anything else was accomplished. So how did the Roman soldiers actually place their shields and standards in the Holy of Holies if they burned it? Okay, interesting. In fact, Josephus actually says that the Romans didn't place their shields and standards in the Holy of Holies. They put it at the east gate. They put them at the east gate, which got a little more room there. But the point is, if words mean anything, the east gate is not the holy place. It's not the holy place. It can't be. Okay, so Josephus argues against the view himself. Now, here's another issue. Number 8, Josephus also records that the Roman army constructed a retaining wall around Jerusalem prior to entering the city and decimating it. Certainly that's going to prevent anyone from escaping. If they're going to construct this wall around the city and then besiege it, they have to get to the Holy of Holies and set up the abomination, and then you flee. If there's a retaining wall there, they couldn't flee. It's too late. Not only is that retaining wall significant, but Josephus also tells us that it took 7 months to construct that retaining wall around Jerusalem. Okay? That really makes Jesus' words kind of almost meaningless. Because what he's saying is, hey, when you see the abomination of desolation, flee. He's almost describing, I think he is describing an event that happens quickly, unexpectedly, and their response is to flee. Okay, they had 7 months of time before they finished this retaining wall to flee, and so it's not surprising that this number 9 item is an important thing. That the siege of Jerusalem didn't happen in a very short period of time. It took months and months and months. Okay, Jesus is saying when the abomination is set up, you need to flee. Well, by the time that happened, it was too late to flee. Okay, nobody could have fled, not only because the Romans were there surrounding the city, but there was a retaining wall that was there also. Okay. Here's a couple from me. Number 10. If the abomination of desolation is set up by the little horn, and we know that from Daniel. We have our Daniel framework, okay, that Matthew needs to adhere to. If the abomination is set up by the little horn, then the other question is, who was the little horn? In 70 AD, who was the Antichrist? Who was the little horn? Okay. There are some things. It could not have been Titus. He was the general that besieged Rome and won it, because what do we know happens to the little horn at the end? He's destroyed. He's killed. Okay. What happened to Titus after he besieged Jerusalem? He took slaves and everything, went back to Rome, and had a victory party. He didn't die. Okay. Same for the Roman army. They weren't destroyed. Okay, they went back to Rome and celebrated their victory. Couldn't have been Nero. Nero he died in 68, 3 years before the destruction of Jerusalem. He couldn't have been, the little horn. And it couldn't have been either Titus's father, Vespasian, okay, who sent Titus to go do this. He was alive at the end of the siege of Jerusalem also. Okay, so it's a legitimate question. There's no one identified as the abomination or as the little horn during 70 A.D. that really, brings home the mustard there. Okay.
And I think the Caesar at that time gave direct orders that the temple was not to be destroyed.
Yes,
anyway.
the guards were a little more zealous because Titus, he wanted probably the temple preserved. The soldiers, were so upset at the Jews, they burned it in disobedience to Titus. And so that's another reason why they couldn't have showed up at the Holy of Holies. It was burning. Okay, finally, we know Daniel 12:1, there were Jews saved, right? Those that are in the book will be rescued out of that. Okay, what Jews were rescued during the siege of Jerusalem? They killed pretty much all of them. Okay, there was no remnant of faithful Jews that survived in Jerusalem during that siege. They killed women, they killed children, they killed everybody. Okay, abomination of desolation. How are we doing here? I knew this was going to be a long one. Let's see if we can get through some of these things. Well, we can cover the next section. It's fairly short. Matthew 24:16 through 20. Okay, really describes the reader's response. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. That's the immediate response. And then Jesus really gives a couple of illustrations about the urgency by which these Jews are to flee. He says, whoever's on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are in his house. Okay? Don't pack anything. You don't have time. Get out now. Okay? Whoever's in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. Probably a command to, hey, if you're watching the flocks out there, you're a shepherd out there, don't go back to the house for your clothes. Run. Flee. Okay? Very urgent. It says, woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. Okay, an appeal to mothers. You notice how many mothers in here in Sunday school class with little kids. Almost none. None, because it's difficult to round up kids to go anywhere, right? Appeal to mothers, young children. Okay, pray it doesn't happen in the winter. Certainly harder to go somewhere in bad weather. Cold weather. Of course, I got to think. Israel's almost desert, but what does it mean? Bad weather there. I don't know. And the Sabbath. Okay, pray it's not on the Sabbath. The Jews had restrictions about traveling on the Sabbath, so be difficult to flee any distance from your home if it was the Sabbath, that kind of stuff. So all illustrations of kind of the urgency that Jesus is talking about now here. I think I can cover one more little piece of the pie here, verse 21. For then, okay, there will be a great tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will be. Okay, really describes why he's telling the Jews that when you see the abomination of desolation, you need to flee. Okay, because there will be great tribulation, it's not occurred ever since then. What does the word tribulation mean? It means distress. Okay, This will be the worst time that the world has ever seen. And because there can only be one time that, has the worst events that the world has ever seen, then this must be equivalent to the Jeremiah 30, verse 7, time of Jacob's trouble. Okay, similar description. Worse than ever to be. And also the time of distress in Daniel 12:1. Okay, and from Daniel 12:1, we know, in combination with the later text in Daniel 12, we know that this distress will occur in the final 3.5 years of Daniel's framework there. Okay, we call it the Great Tribulation. It's kind of those in our camp label the second 3.5 years of the 70th week of Daniel, the 7 years tribulation. We call that the Great Tribulation. It's the worst part of that.
And that's because God himself is really the one doing the judging at this point.
Yes.
Before the first 3.5, God's just letting man do whatever he wants to do without intervening. And that's bad.
But it's also clear that even though man is doing it, God is the source of producing those. Yeah, absolutely. We'll look at that in Revelation. That's an interesting point that we'll nail down in Revelation 6. Okay, it lots of Ezekiel imagery. So there are those that claim that the wrath that's experienced in the first half of the tribulation period, or even the first 3/4 of the tribulation period, okay, the pre-wrath view, is not the wrath of God. Okay, and therefore they can use the Thessalonian passage, "We're not destined for wrath," to say, the church is going to go through half of the tribulation or 3/4 of the tribulation, because that part's not God doing the wrath. Okay, so we'll get to that and study that in great detail. Let me skip all the way down to the final paragraph because we're out of time. So the description of the Great Tribulation in verse 22, why could that also be an argument against all of this being fulfilled in 70 AD? Well, how many Jews were killed in 70 AD by the Romans? Josephus tells us about 1.1 million Jews were killed in 70 AD in that siege. A lot of Jews. Okay. How many Jews were killed in World War II by the Nazis? About 6 million. Okay. So if there were 1.1 million Jews killed in 70 AD, and there were 6 million Jews killed in World War II, how is a 70 AD massacre such as not has occurred nor ever will be since the creation of, in the beginning? How is the 1.1 million worse than the 6 million killed? Okay? It's not. It's not. Obviously, it's not. It's another, I think, solid reason why the preterism view is absolutely wrong in Matthew 24. Okay, that siege in Jerusalem was not the worst thing that has ever happened to the Jews. Okay, World War II was way worse, and unfortunately, what happened to them in World War II is nothing compared to what's going to happen to them when Matthew 24 is fulfilled in the future. That will be the worst time for the nation of Israel, and it's still future according to our perspective. So I'll come back and revisit this middle section on the last page. It really is going to pick up in verse 22. What does it mean that Jesus said, unless those days were cut short, no life would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days would be shortened. There's another aberrant view that comes out of that passage called the pre-wrath rapture view. And we'll mention it a little bit if we have time, towards the end of this class, this semester. We'll take a look at how how a lawyer with no theological training, with a whole summer of time to do nothing and a Bible search piece of software on his computer, came up with this aberrant view. And unfortunately, he convinced a very important theologian at the Friends of Israel Gospel Ministries to go along with it. Okay? It's definitely an aberrant view. Guy makes a critical mistake in interpreting what the day of the Lord is. Remember, there have been numerous times over the past 10 years where I've spent a little bit of time talking about what is the day of the Lord. Well, there is a wide sense meaning and there is a very narrow sense meaning. Okay? And unfortunately, the guy that invented this view doesn't see a distinction between a wide sense view and a narrow sense view. He assumes it's all narrow sense view. That's the mistake he made in coming up with the pre-wrath rapture view. Unfortunately, this is a view that's gained popularity, not a whole lot, but it is a popular view. And it's these guys have gone around the country having seminars and stuff, and all you need to do is convince your pastor that this is true, and you got the whole congregation believing it now too. So we're gonna put a nail in that coffin of the pre-wrath rapture view because it's important. It's important, and eventually we'll talk about what is the biblical evidence for the pre-trib rapture view. It's an important view, and I think it's the correct one. Okay, too late. Enough time.
I knew Mark Rosenthal.
Did you?
When he was writing that book, he would actually visit our dorm room. And I'm like, what is wrong with you?
Yeah.
There was long discussions with it.
I tried for the longest time to get Renal Showers a copy of his it's like 30-page handwritten objections to when Rosenthal and what's the lawyer's name?
I don't remember.
Is it?
I know exactly.
Yeah.
I don't remember his name.
Yeah, I don't remember his name. I got the book.
He sent me the book.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like,
Yeah, the Rapture View, plain and simple. Yeah. It was a shame, and it was actually. I think that's why Dr. Showers actually wrote Maranatha, was really in response to the pre-wrath view, because he was so bothered, by one of his ministry, partners for years.
well, director of Friends of Israel for how long?
Yeah.
It was bizarre.
Yeah.
Like, what in the world?
Is he still alive?
No, he died.
No, okay.
He died several years ago.
Well, he's back to pre-trib rapture now. He knows the truth of it.
Yeah, before he went off the deep end, he used to come to my home church, and he's been in my house. My parents had him for dinner and stuff, but
Yeah.
it wasn't long after that.
I mean,
Zion's Hope, and then that
Yeah.
park in
yeah,
Orlando.
the
the Holy Land experience.
got to believe that, in God's sovereignty, there was a purpose for even that. But it does make me fearful, it's a difficult thing to disagree with, like a Walvert or any of these minor deities in dispensational eschatology. But when I think they're wrong, I'm going to say I think they're wrong, and here's my evidence for it. And I'm just going to say, hey, they're wrong. Here's
Well,
the
I was just
reason.
a Bible college student with 5 other pastoral students in my dorm, and he would come and talk to us about his ideas, and all of us were like,
Doesn't sound right.
this isn't right, man. We're just kids, but this isn't right.
Yeah.
And he just kept going deeper and deeper into it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's
Hi, Jonathan.
hello. And the book is just.